over here. So I thank you everyone for being here. I have the privilege today to introduce Professor Dr. Nidhi Singhal. Thank you for joining us, Nidhi. Nidhi is a professor of disability and inclusive education at the Faculty of Education, and she's the vice president of Hughes Hall College, University of Cambridge, and she has worked extensively with children and young people with disabilities in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Her research examines the educational experiences of children with disabilities, the quality of teaching and learning in mainstream classrooms, and the impact of schooling. So she has also worked closely with international donor and bilateral agencies and international non-governmental organizations, and assisting them in developing research projects, undertaking program evaluations, and providing evidence-based policy advice on a wide range of issues aimed at fulfilling commitments towards inclusive education. Nidhi has numerous publications aimed at academic and policy audiences, focusing on educational inequalities and methodological issues in undertaking educational research with marginalized groups in the global South. And Nidhi is also the youngest professor at Cambridge, isn't it so, Nidhi? So really privileged to have you over there. Thank you so much for accepting to come to our EduSpeak series. So over to you, Nidhi. We'll be talking about children with disabilities and the centrality of schooling, especially with reference to COVID-19. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tayaba, and thank you so much for such a very kind introduction. It's honestly a real privilege and a pleasure to be here and to be engaging and talking about some recent research we finished. So I'm going to first of all just start by sharing my screen because I do have a few PowerPoints to look at. So there we go. Okay. So I've got around 20 minutes and I'll try and get my timer started so that we can begin the discussions after I've finished presenting. So as Tayaba said, I'm going to be looking at education of children with disabilities during COVID-19. Just to begin with, I think it's really important to underscore that focusing on disability is a really important development agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, incorporate the need to ensure that persons with disabilities are centrally located in development efforts. In addition to that, there is a growing recognition that we need to educate children with disabilities. And this is very much underpinned by three real themes emerging in the literature. One is the whole human rights discourse. It's socially just. It's the right thing to do. Secondly, it's an economic imperative that we do that because education, even for individuals with disabilities, results in really high individual and also national returns. So it helps in increase national productivity. There's some really interesting research which shows around returns to GDP and individual returns also get increased. And finally, and rather strongly, and the argument I'll be putting forth today is that schools designed for all are better schools for all. Okay, so taking that as the starting point, in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on a research project, which was just very recently completed, where we examined COVID-19 and the impact that due to school closures, what was happening in the learning lives of children with disabilities who were specifically enrolled in schools prior to the pandemic. And that's important to understand. These kids were going to schools before the pandemic and before school closures. We looked at what were the educational experiences, what were the main concerns, and indeed the main opportunities that were identified in relation to the education during these times. So broadly, these are the three questions that I'll attempt to highlight during this talk. And no talk is successful without the team which is behind what I'm presenting. So These are the photographs of the project leads. So we had Dr. Eric Kumar in Malawi, who led the team in Malawi, Amiro, who led the team in Ethiopia, and Dr. Neeraj Podial, who led the team in Nepal. They were centrally involved in the data collection. And Shruti Theresia Johansson is a senior lecturer at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. The project was funded by Cambridge Africa and also WISE, that's the Qatar Foundation in Qatar. So huge contributions from each of these individuals. I'm just one small entity in all this. So as we all know, COVID-19 resulted in some of the longest school closures during peacetime. Okay, these closures were unplanned and abrupt. And when schools closed, no one had any idea when they were going to open up. Just to give you an example, in Nepal, schools were closed for nearly 2 years. The state did institute various national TV and radio programs, but the uptake of these was very limited. Online classes were run by certain private schools, but that really covered only 24% of the population. Some general guidelines were introduced in relation to what teachers should be doing about educating children, but really they didn't cover much about children with disabilities. And Nepal is just an example which illustrates the more or less what happened for all children with disabilities across many countries in the global south. This slide is basically a visual representation of the 3 countries that I'm going to be talking about, the data from here. So as I said, we looked at Ethiopia, we undertook telephone surveys in Nepal, and we also undertook telephone surveys in Malawi. Across the 3 countries, approximately 260 parents were interviewed, and in addition, 150 teachers. In this presentation, I'm going to only focus on the parental data. The parents all had children with disabilities who were attending a primary school before school closure. So they were attending a primary school. They were all attending some sort of a government school in many cases. For instance, in Ethiopia, you had the mainstream school, which was being supported by what is known as the Inclusive Education Resource Centers. Okay, these are particular centers which support children with disabilities in different mainstream schools. We also had children who were attending special schools. And in all the 3 countries, we had a good mix of children who were going to a mainstream school or to a special school and a whole range of disabilities. So the research approach we basically adopted, just a very few reflections on this. We developed the teacher survey and the parent survey, both were telephone surveys, in very close collaboration with the country teams. The aim was to have a common framework, but also to ensure they were appropriately contextualized. So we had lots of conversations about what this means in Ethiopia, what does the school look like in Nepal, etc. We sought ethical approval, both at the institutional level, and we also had huge discussions around what does ethics look like at the individual level, and how do we give parents and teachers the opportunities to disengage, not be interviewed, etc., and how to also to encourage their engagement. The survey had approximately 34 questions, 30 multiple choice questions, and 4 open-ended questions. Most of the multiple choice had options which were easier to articulate on the telephone and get an answer. All the surveys were first developed in English and then translated in local languages as appropriate. Researchers, they had a team of 2 researchers in each country. So under the research head, we had around 2 researchers in most countries. The researcher made the initial call to the parent. The telephones were harvested from local education authorities. So we went to local education authorities and took permission to contact the schools. From the schools, we took permission to contact the parents and hence got phone numbers. The first call to the parent was to explain the purpose, ethical questions, what we're going to do with the data, etc. We followed it by SMS, which was provided summary consent and confirmation of a time of the interview. And then a call was made to do the interview and to recheck willingness, reiterate issues around confidentiality, etc. And we also gave some small token of appreciation to each of the participants. I must admit, it was a hugely emotional project, doing it during COVID. And when the project was going on, not only we were talking to parents, but mostly everyone in the team at some point or other came down with COVID. So it became very personal at very different levels throughout the research journey. So my next few slides are going to be focusing on the findings. What I'm going to do is basically illustrate some key themes from each of the countries rather than providing you a whole overview of findings from each country. So they're just going to be snapshots of results from each of the 3 countries. The headline here being there are differences in how many times teachers contacted students with disabilities. So that was one thing we were trying to look at. So what was the level of contact between children with disabilities and schools and the teachers who had been teaching them? And what we found that the contact varied across and within countries. So here is an example of Nepal. On the left-hand side is the graph which shows 2 provinces where we collected data. One province is known as the Bagmati province, where you see 89% of the parents said that the teacher had contacted them, whereas in province 2, only 32% of the parents said that the teachers had contacted the parents of the child. The level of contact in Nepal was higher than in Ethiopia, okay? And teachers in Nepal contacted children and their parents on their own initiative. There were no formal guidelines introduced by the state. The provincial differences, we argue, could be because of difference in online access in relation to Bagmati, which is a little more prosperous province, and also the fact that there were a lot of NGO-run initiatives in this province, which might have resulted in teachers being more malleable to contacting parents of children with disabilities. On the right-hand side of the slide is differences according to type of school in Nepal. And what you see is the bar which shows that if a child was attending a special school, he or she was more likely to be contacted by the teacher. So 77% in relation to special schools compared to 22% in mainstream with resource classes. Important to note, all mainstream schools in Nepal, which include children with disabilities, have a resource class. Now, there could be lots of differences. This could reflect generally the very low engagement of public schools with their students during closures, which we heard a lot about in Nepal. It could also signal the likelihood that within larger schools, mainstream schools, the needs of this very small population was being neglected. Nonetheless, there are really interesting differences here. Across the countries, what we also see that generally children with disabilities were the ones who face significantly more challenges than children without disabilities during closures. Here's an illustration of some data we found from Malawi and more or less again replicates some of the trends we saw in the other countries. Parents reported little or no support in most cases. So parents talked about that they didn't understand sign language or they didn't know how to do Braille, how to read Braille, and hence could not engage with a child with disabilities or support their learning. I'm just going to read out a quote from a mother of a blind child. And she notes here, "I'm a barrier to my own daughter's education. I'm unable to support her when she's studying because I'm unable to read Braille materials. My daughter feels jealous when I'm assisting other children who use print. I see my daughter looking hurt. It is as if I'm not interested in her schoolwork, which is not the case. This really troubles me." So there was huge degree of guilt amongst parents about being unable to support their child's learning. They talked about the fact that radio programs which had been introduced in Malawi did not account for the needs of children with disabilities. Parents across the community talked about learning loss, but they also talked about the significant impact of school closures on their child's social and emotional well-being. So for instance, in Malawi, there was lack of any support material within the household because like Braille books and other textbooks had been left behind. Children were asked to leave the school material behind in schools because schools were worried when they reopened, they will not have any teaching and learning material. Parents also talked about that when the child is at school, it's much safer. Whereas when the child is at home, they're more likely to be facing various risks. For girls, this was hugely pronounced, where parents talked about risks and vulnerabilities in terms of sexual encounters. But this was not just limited to girls. They also spoke about this in relation to boys. Finally, parents also reflected on the lack of therapies and essential services, which mostly are delivered through schools. And this was really interesting when schools shut down. Physiotherapy, speech therapy, all those things that are vital to the development of a child with disabilities were lost. Many children who are in residential schools were now back at home, and families talked about the struggles in terms of feeding them because their own income generation had fallen down because of the shutdown of the economy. So now just moving on to also highlighting some interesting gender differences. And on this slide, I'm using Nepal as an illustration. What our data from Nepal showed that when parents were talking about the girls with disabilities, they were talking about how they were spending more time studying. So we asked them in the survey to show, give us an idea of how many hours was a child studying on a day, on a weekly basis, etc. Parents of boys were more likely to report that their child was not studying at all during closures. Internet access was commonly low, but interestingly, the girls with disabilities in Nepal were more likely to be accessing internet and other devices to support their learning. Starkest variation was in use of phone, where 66% of the girls were using the phone for learning, whereas only 32% of the boys were. Parents were more confident that the girls with disabilities would return to school, and they were more concerned about the boys, especially those in the higher age group, that they'll not return to school, and indeed the impact this will have on their future learning opportunities and income generation opportunities. Here I'm going to present data from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a really interesting case because when we started data collection, during the phase of data collection in Ethiopia, schools were beginning to open up. So this gave us a unique snapshot into were children with disabilities even likely to come back to school once schools started opening up. And what we observed from teachers and school visits is that 62% of the teachers said that almost all students with disabilities who had been enrolled in school beforehand were returning. And that was really interesting. And 29% reported that nothing special had been done to encourage them to report. They were just coming back to school. Of course, they were concerned in relation to opening. They were concerned about safety and hygiene for children with disabilities, but also for all children. They were hugely concerned about issues around learning loss and low motivation amongst children and what to do about it. And they talked about, will earlier systems of support which existed in the school, will they be returned? Will they come back? So Ethiopia is an example where they have resource centers. So there's a lot of traveling specialists to different mainstream schools. And indeed, they also talked about the fact there was some lack of discussions around how to teach learners, especially children with disabilities, who at times can be very difficult to explain things, simple things like social distancing, etc. But what's really heartening to see here is that children were coming back to school. They were there. They were returning when schools were opening. I realize I'm coming short to my time, so I'm going to just go on to some concluding reflections, and I'm going to highlight 4 things here. My first plea is, what our findings show is the reaffirming importance of education for children with disabilities. Parental responses clearly highlighted the significant belief that they placed in the value of education for their child with disabilities. And they were confident that their child will return to school. And what's really interesting, that this is contrary to commonly held assumptions that persons of children with disabilities, that parents of children with disabilities are not supportive of their child's education. What we were hearing is the huge value they placed in education for its socioeconomic, emotional benefits and its benefits for future life opportunities. The centrality of schooling for children with disabilities was absolutely evident. Not only were schools recognized as sites for formal learning, indeed literacy, numeracy, but really important safe spaces for also nurturing social belonging. They were also important for promoting nutritional well-being in many of these families which had very low income, and just hugely significant in the case of Malawi. And very importantly, schools were also sites where parents could make sure that their child with disabilities access specialist settings. And this also could be it could be a reflection of the lack of these services within the primary healthcare center. So many of these services are easily provided through schools. So schools were not just places you came to study arithmetic or a subject area, but much more than that in the perceptions of parents. So what we argue that as schools reopen, there's a need for a more holistic approach to education, which addresses students' learning, their social and emotional needs. It's not simply about addressing a learning crisis, but as schools reopen, there is a need to focus on the underlying principles of inclusivity. There is a need to rebalance the curriculum, which must focus on developing essential competencies, including cognitive, social, and emotional domains for all children, and including children with disabilities. We've seen how physical space of the school can be quickly disrupted, and equally it can be reimagined. But it's really important for schools to exist to fulfill this larger vision. My final reflection here is to invite us to look beyond the challenges and acknowledge the significant stories of resilience and hope noted by many parents in the interviews we did. Their desire for schooling, their desire for their child to be provided for with a better life. And these are rather interesting dissonances in relation to what we tend to assume as given knowledge about parental neglect and disregard. The aim here is not to deny the significant vulnerabilities, exclusion, and discrimination, nor is it to say that the state hasn't failed or the school system hasn't failed children with disabilities. Rather, the aim for me highlighting these nuanced enablers is to reveal the need for developing a deeper narrative. It is an acknowledgement of the heterogeneity in lived realities and a recognition of the multiplicity of meaning and possibilities. And it is only by engaging with these nuances can we respond more effectively to the needs of children rather than reproducing a deficit-driven narrative around disability and education, which is very commonly highlighted in the literature. So I'm going to finish my remarks here by just highlighting this particular quote by Noava and Alvin, where they say that every day we define a little or a lot of the history of the future. And I think the COVID-19 and the reflections it provides has given us a really important impetus to revisit schooling, and especially schooling for children with disabilities. And also finally, it's an invitation for all of you to visit the Cambridge Network for Disability Education and Research website. It's a very vibrant network of scholars from the Global South. We run a reading group and a seminar series, and we also have lots of materials from the work I've just presented right now. I'm going to stop here and back to you, Tayaba.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. It's very, very interesting to listen to you. The floor is open for questions, and by the time questions come, I have a question, and I have just wondered, this is about what you say is very interesting because they're talking about very positive parental support for children with disabilities. Now, what we see in Pakistan at times, and this has been discussed in our classes also, that at times the parents who have a child with some sort of disability is sort of like ashamed of having a child, as if the child has been sort of like is there because of something wrong that they have done. This is one thing. And sometimes they're also reluctant to send them to school, A. B is at times when these children are in school, the parents of other children really object. And there's a big problem. And these are actual examples where, the students actually discussed where then the school had to ask the child with a disability to leave, although the parent was paying more, even in, high fee schools, because other parents would object to the child being there. So over to you.
Okay, thanks, Nayaba, for getting us started. I must admit, yes, there are stories of parental neglect or parents not wanting to send their children to school because of sociocultural aspects. But what I'm trying to really highlight is that's not the start and the end of the story. We also have parents of children with disabilities who are hugely committed. And it's really important to understand why is it that this discrepancy exists. So just to give you an example, there was a research study, and I'm trying to think of the name of the researchers. It was a study in Kenya. Okay, so there was a community there, and they did a community ethnographic study in which the researchers had been told that children with disabilities were not being sent to school, so they had to go and find out where children with disabilities were not being sent to school. So they went and they started digging around because the assumption was we needed to do a social awareness program in that community. So, so in order to support that, let's go and find out what are the issues around stigma. And when these researchers started talking to the parents in this community, they said, well, we don't even send our other child without disabilities to school because the schools are so useless in terms of the quality of schooling offered. And so what I'm trying to argue here is that the narratives are not so simple. So for instance, we did the Recoup project in India, 2005, 2010, Tayaba, there was this big project which you know about. We did it in India, we did it in Pakistan, Ghana, and Kenya. In India, what became really, really clear is that the trickle-down effect of education, of schooling, the very fact that free primary education was becoming more common resulted in people more or less assuming the naturalization of schooling for their child with disabilities also. And that was so interesting to see that that trickle-down effect held in relation to a child with disabilities. Parents argued they now have a right to send their child to school. It's good, I'll send the child to school because I can go and actually spend some time making some daily wage labor. The child is sitting in the school, okay? The child needs to go to school because you know what? Previously, traditionally, what used to happen when I'm no more, the child with disabilities, my little kid with disabilities would be taken care of by the brother or the sister. But abhi zamana badal gaya hai. Things have changed now, right? I cannot rely on my elder son to take care of my younger daughter with disabilities. They need to stand on their own feet. So the discourse was changing. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this discourse is changing, right? And then look for opportunities there to make that discourse hold rather than assuming that it hasn't changed. Your second point about parents of other children and them feeling uncomfortable. Absolutely. That is, again, very common. It's common in this country. I'm sitting in the UK, so it's common in the United Kingdom also, where there's such a lot of discourse around inclusive education. That's where it's really important to have dialogue. Okay, that is going to happen. That's happened when girls started coming to school too. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have Dr. Hassan Mahyuddin and then Niaz Malik. Ji, Dr. Hassan Mahyuddin. Hassan, we can't hear you. All right. So we can come back to you, Hassan, while we sort of like, if we'll come back to you in a moment while you figure out this issue. So Niaz, could you go ahead with your question, and then Hassan, you could also put a question in the chat. Sorry, Niaz, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. I have 102 fever, and I have attended this because this cause is so important. I just want to give you a little bit of my background. I was the CEO of Zong, and about 6 years ago, I got into an accident and got paralyzed from the neck down. And since then, after, coming to some senses with regards to what had happened, I started working, with the people with the disabilities in Pakistan and realized how cruel the world is here. So, this is something that is very important to me. So I was wondering if, in the future, what kind of initiatives you would be taking so that Pakistan could become part of this. And in major universities and even in the hospitals of Pakistan, we don't find access for people with disabilities. And it's such a major issue. I take this with most CEOs because I feel like the change has to be brought from the top down. And I would probably be needing some assistance. So I would be, getting off shortly because I'm not feeling well today. But I thought that first of all, thank you for this incredible research and findings. And the second thing is, what could we do, in Pakistan to transform this process? Obviously, it's going to take a long time, but any assistance in this regard would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Niaz. Over to you, Nidhi.
Hugely humbled that you joined us, Niaz. Really grateful for you making the time, especially when you're not very well. And I do hope you get better soon. You raised some really interesting points. I can't answer for Pakistan, but one can offer oneself as a collaborator, as one has been working in Pakistan. And there are really some really interesting initiatives taking place. Like, for instance, Asar Pakistan was one of the very first initiatives across the global south, which actually went along and collected data on children with disabilities. So what we did with them, with Bela, who is a force for good, collected data on disability of children as a disaggregated variable within learning outcomes, and were able to really provide some unique insights into the lack of quality schooling they were receiving even when they were going to school. So that's just one example, and that has been really powerful in terms of how it has informed some of the advocacy efforts around education of children with disabilities. Tayaba is much more in a much stronger position to answer about the initiatives taking place, but I do think, Niaz, there's a huge role for research to play, evidence to play in advocacy. And in my work in many countries in the South Asian region, what I find is the lack of strong evidence. When you don't have evidence, evidence is not an excuse for inaction, but without evidence, it's very difficult to advocate strongly and to also make an argument for what you're advocating, what is needed to be done effectively in the field. So I think research and advocacy are two very strong ways of moving forward in different fields within this area. At least that's what my own work over the last few years has shown me. But Tayaba, you might want to come in here and add something more from a Pakistani context.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. I think, Niaz, I'm afraid we are not doing much. I think we're doing something in education, but we are not really sort of like so focusing on the needs of children, of people with disabilities, is still something not right out there. So it's quite, but it would need a lot of advocacy. And the main thing is, first of all, begin at least accepting them in schools, begin actually accepting them as peers, give them this, opportunity of parity of participation first in education, and, gradually things grow. But you're right, you're absolutely right. I think we have, look at educational institutions, look at our infrastructure, they're hardly geared to serve the needs of people with children with disability. So I totally agree with you. So I have a question in the chat, and then I'll give this, then I will, I have Basirat over here also. So just hold on a moment. The question in the chat by Hassan, I suppose, is that what do you think was the most important factor for the parents to send their children back to school, as the children with disability? We asked this question, Nidhi, because there is the fear that there will be lots of dropouts, and because of this economic crunch. And usually parents choose who to send to school and who not to sort of send to school. So any comment? Over to you.
Oh, that's a really good question. And that's a very common argument being put forth that, there is a real crisis. Will children return to school? And more so, will children with disabilities return to school? As I showed you from our evidence in Ethiopia, their children with disabilities were returning to school. What was the reason? I think one of the main reasons from what we heard from the parents' perspective was the fact that they believed that schooling offered better life opportunities. Also important to emphasize is that in many the schools we looked at, the teachers we spoke to were working in government mainstream schools, and that's free primary. So, and there was not an issue of um, expenditure, which Tayaba you alluded to, like they weren't making a decision about sending the boy or sending the girl. Rather, there was free primary education and access to that. And this hope that education would deliver some long-term goals was one thing. And secondly, I cannot emphasize enough the lack of social and emotional stimulation was a big concern for these parents. The fact that they saw their children, I couldn't provide all the graphs here, but parents reported the child feeling more anxious, more angry, lonelier during these school closures, their child with disabilities in comparison to children without disabilities in the same household. Okay, so there was huge emotional imperatives that resulted in parents being wanting the child to go back to school.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Basirat, would you like to come in?
Yes, can you hear me?
Ji, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nidhi, for sharing such insightful findings from your project. This isn't a question, it's just a reflection based on what you have shared. I think one of the things that struck me the most was the part you read out where the parents said, I really wanted to help my child, but I became a barrier to the child because I did not understand Braille, or I didn't know how to read Braille. And that just brings to mind the important, not just the willingness, you have so much emphasized the willingness of parents to actually participate in their children's education, but not just the willingness, it's the frustration that they feel from not being able to participate. And that frustration, I don't think is fully appreciated, or better still, is fully taken advantage of. And so it would be good, as research continues to grow and to expand, to really look at these areas, the recognition of these parents as partners in education and how these parents can be better supported to support their children, because truly that is what they're trying to do. So again, thank you. This is just a reflection, not a question.
I think, Basira, this is it's absolutely excellent point over here. And I also wanted to ask Nidhi, so thinking of inclusive education, could we possibly expand it to parents or somehow bring them in the loop? Like Basira has used this excellent word of parents as partners.
Absolutely. Lovely to see you here, Basirat. So if you actually read the big report, it's all about parents as partners. I didn't have enough time, so I actually had to remove that slide, which I'm really disappointed I did now. But coming back to the point, that's so centrally important. Schools need to reconfigure themselves where parents are not simply outside the boundary of the school. And COVID-19 has been a really interesting pause for reflection. So suddenly we had parents who were becoming the primary teachers, quote unquote, for their child with disabilities. And this is not just for children with disabilities, even without disabilities, parents were the main teachers when learning was being zoomed, in, or whatever the case might be. Suddenly parents were the ones who were main teachers. And this is so centrally important. So in Malawi, the quote which I read out, and it's very much about the fact that these were children who were attending schools where they were being taught in sign language sometimes, okay? And that was true for Nepal and for Ethiopia. And the parents were not actually being taught the sign language. So now when the child was at home for 2 years, actually they didn't know how to communicate with each other. None of the siblings knew. So the reconfiguration of the boundaries around the schooling and the home needs to be thought through. There's some really interesting work which was undertaken by another of my PhD students called Tilanka. And she looked at it in relation to Sri Lanka. And there again, exactly the same thing came up. These kids were coming back, and she looks at deaf special schools in Sri Lanka. And what she found, the dissonance between schools and what was happening in schools and parents was hugely stark. And this kind of a reconfiguration of schools is something I've talked about a lot in terms of parents as partners. And I'm very happy to drop a few links in the chat if people are interested in taking that forward. But point well made, Basirat.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. We would love to have those resources. Ji Malia, over to you.
Firstly, thank you so much, Nidhi. This is actually very enlightening. My question, however, involves, the response of the various governments that, the response to COVID-19 was obviously radio channels and TV channels. We had a similar program in Pakistan. What I find interesting is that, the disabled kids, children with disabilities, were completely ignored. And I feel that maybe we should be looking at all of this from a policy level, which, it is a clear indication, the fact that the response to COVID-19 in terms of education was so limited to, children without disabilities, reinforces the fact that our policy is ignoring or evading, or maybe it is not focusing on inclusive education as we may speak. So here my concern would be that how do we engage this research towards a more holistic level, or a rather broader level, whereby we actually speak of policy. And of course, I do agree with the parent school level engagement, etc. But if something like this is to happen again, and I'm sure it does, we have look at what's happening in Ukraine. I'm sure they're going to have school closures there as well. How does the policy actually needs to be changed, or needs to be how would the policy actually engage with this research? That would be my question.
Nidhi, over to you.
Okay, Malia, fantastic point. Engaging with policymakers is really important, and no point in research if it's going to sit on a shelf. So we have actually been engaging a lot with policymakers, but as you know, there are no simple causal pathways between research and policy change. So in response to your question, you need to start somewhere. And this is where we decided to start. We decided to look at the experiences of those who at the times of crisis are the ones who get excluded and left behind the furthest. What is rather interesting is even when more mainstream education research projects were collecting data on what is happening in the lives of children during COVID-19 and school closures, they weren't actually collecting data on children with disabilities. So there's a huge invisibility of children with disabilities, which runs from micro level, school level, teachers not wanting to contact them or being unable to contact them, to researchers working in the field, and indeed to policy and state response. What one can do in relation to making research more accessible is make sure it's disseminated in different forums in different ways. And also one needs to establish that dialogue. So for instance, just a small example, we have been working with the Inclusive Education Initiative based at the bank. And as you know, the World Bank has many country offices, and they've been advocating a lot for disability issues. But again, I wouldn't be naive to say that one does one research and there is a causal change at the policy level. I think it's a concerted effort of people recognizing there's an issue and recognizing there's something that can be done about it. What I get really worried about, and one of the things I was saying in my last slide, is this kind of inertia towards assuming nothing can be done. Everything's bad, everything's horrible, we're never going to start change. Whereas my approach to this is you have to look for enablers. There are possibilities. Parents, as Basirat highlighted, parents as is coming in the findings. We have to move away from homogenized discourses of no one listens or there's nothing good happening, rather looking for points of engagement, which can result in points for change.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Abdal, I think you raised your hand earlier. Ji, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the presentation. So my question is more about a broader policy level question, might be slightly beyond the scope of the study, but still would love to hear from your thoughts on that. So one of the tendencies that systems usually have, at least in South Asian countries, is that they try to create separate streams for children with disability. For example, to give you an example, in Pakistan, in almost all of the 4 provinces, there's a special education department that has its own schools that caters to children with disability. Now, there's a double-edged sword effect to that. One is that while you are creating facilities that are specifically designed for children with disability and caters to them, but at the same time, you are excluding them from the mainstream education. What my question is in your study or in your broader experience, can you sort of, what is more preferred, what is more valuable? And I know this is not a tangible answer right now, but just would love to hear your thoughts on how policy making can be done so that children can be included in the system, but at the same time being provided for, because mostly systems find it very difficult to provide budgets at an entire provincial or national level to upgrade all of the schools. So thank you so much.
Wow, Abdul, I can start off another whole presentation for an hour or a discussion more than a presentation. It is such a fantastic question and the one which gets asked very often. There's so many different layers to it. So let me try and tackle it in some coherent manner in a few minutes. So there is a lot of research. If there was a simple answer, there wouldn't have been an issue of a debate, right? I mean, there isn't a simple answer. Every country does it very differently. Countries in the global south do it very differently within the country context and across countries again, okay? So there is a complete focus on ensuring that mainstream education ministries also take into account the needs of children with disabilities. So there's a huge lot of focus and push towards that not to have a separate ministry or department for special education, but to mainstream it within the mainstream ministries of education. That's seen over the years as what works best. Okay, that works supposedly best in terms of funding mechanisms also, though on the other hand, as someone who's done a lot of work in the South Asian region, I also see very interesting policy and program declarations which promise the world and are never substantiated by the funding, tangible funds. Okay, so in India is a really interesting example. For instance, one of the policy programs says that every child with disabilities in a secondary education school will have, every group of 5 children in secondary school will have one special teacher. And if we actually calculate the amount of money that would be required, it's way beyond the Indian national education budget. Okay, so there are absolutely huge dissonances there. Your point is around what is better. I am a firm believer of the twin track approach. You need to bring about reforms within the mainstream education system. It is about the all. And focusing on most marginalized groups allows you to change and navigate what this education system looks like. You know, you bring about changes because you're trying to focus on everybody. There will be changes in terms of pedagogical styles. There'll be changes in curriculum. There'll be changes in assessment as you try and respond to the increased diversity of learners in your classroom, in your school system. And in parallel, you have to focus on some specialized services which are not needed for all. For me, very simplistic binaries around special schools and mainstream schools are I'm not very fond of them. I prefer thinking about more fluidity in our systems. Okay, so inclusive education resource centers in Ethiopia, itinerant teachers models in many countries in Africa, and other such ways of supporting teachers, not just training them. There's a lot of focus on training mainstream teachers all the time, rather than also providing them more support to be able to deliver education and learning in their classrooms. So I am more for more fluid structures which accommodate for the diversity of needs of different children in a setting which responds to their needs for cognitive development, emotional development, social development. Okay, we call them a mainstream classroom or not. Location for me is one part of the aspect. It's also about good quality education and experience and supporting teachers to be able to deliver that. So that's not a cop out, but that's more or less where I stand with the very strong twin track approach, and also not going just for binaries, but thinking creatively about how to support children, all children, including children with disabilities within mainstream education systems. Most of the countries in the global south cannot afford to set up special schools. And that's really good that we can't afford it, because now we have to come up with really interesting ways of making sure that our mainstream classrooms and mainstream schools can actually respond to diversity of learners. And disability, just my final point, disability is not a homogenized silo. Disability is hugely intersectional with notions of gender, ethnicity, tribal affiliations, etc., religion. So, you've got to bring that all together, and that cannot happen by just you responding to a child's disability. I'm going to stop there, Tayaba, otherwise I'll keep going on.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Wonderful to hear your response. We have Dr. Hassan Mohyuddin. Ji, Hassan.
Yep. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Nidhi. That this was a great talk, and the data that you have presented. And I think there are lots of questions. I think I can't stop writing questions. So I have one question about the data that you presented, that during this closures, school closures, so girls actually were more studious than boys, and they were gravitating more towards technology so that they can learn more than boys. So, but did the survey ever try to uncover the reason behind it? And I'm also curious that were these kids studying in the same class, studying the same subjects? Because again, just these numbers and comparisons, I would believe that there are a lot of layers to it. So how can we actually do a more multi-resolution analysis of this one? Yeah, I'll stop. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Nidhi?
Hassan, fantastic question. So few things which I mentioned. This was conducted during COVID. Okay, this was conducted in a very short period of time. It was a telephone survey. You can only ask so many questions on a telephone survey. So we were totally restricted in terms of how many questions we could ask. So we would have loved to delve deeper into why was the case that girls were on the internet more. And this is, by the way, as I said, that was from the Nepal data. That wasn't shared across all the countries. That was specifically for Nepal. That's very important. I mentioned that there. When we were talking to our Nepalese team and asking them what could possibly be happening, so these were the hypotheses they came up with. We don't have qualitative data to argue in either case. So one was, it could be that girls with disabilities were not being sent out because of the notion of being a girl, restricted spaces to move out, whereas boys, they would run away. The other thing was this traditional socio-cultural dynamics in a household between a girl and a boy. Ladke ki zyada sunte hain, so boys are being heard more often by the parents than girls are. So girls get on to doing their study if they're asked to, whereas boys tend to be a little more, don't want to do it. And it's a cultural, that is a very interesting cultural observation, which I totally can relate to, having grown up in India. So we don't have an answer to the why. Okay, we have a survey data, and we're very honest about that. We cannot match the children to the school settings, not at all, because this was all very much based on purposive sampling. What this research does is provide some really interesting insights into the learning of children with disabilities, which has not been captured in the literature anywhere.
Yeah, so my suggestion would be, because I also do a lot of experimental designing myself. So I would be like, if I have to just study this notion of girls versus boys, then I have to I understand it becomes really, really difficult to curate such a data, but to get the best scientific analysis out of it, I think I need to know that whether the girls were already very good students compared to those boys. That's also very important. Then how many, and they were now being closed up in their homes. So maybe the girls had maybe fewer family members on average per home, and maybe the boys belong to a more crowded family, or vice versa. That also impacts a lot. And then the nature of the subject is also very important. So these are the kind of things
Thank you so much.
that I think are very, very important in actually teasing out the best thing, the true lesson from these data and statistics.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and for your suggestions. Nidhi, there is, I have one more question myself, and because we are running out of time, and there is Faryal Humayun, one of my brilliant students again. Faryal, over to you first, and then I have a question for Nidhi.
Hi Nidhi, thank you so much for sharing all that information. I've read up some of your work as well, so I was really interested in listening to this talk today. And so I have a question from the teacher's point of view, because I'm a teacher myself. The thing is that you just spoke something about teacher training, and yes, that is essential. But my question is that, was there any evidence in these researches that you conducted of extra teacher training? Because you see, after COVID-19, when the children returned to school, they from isolation, so not just children with disabilities, but other children also had developed certain mental health issues. So not only did the teachers now had to deal with, a student who can't hear or can't see, but they're also coming from an emotional. Now, in a lot of researches on inclusion, I have observed that teachers' perceptions are that, they want to help these students, but they are unable to do so for a number of reasons, such as lack of time or resources. And now with this additional pressure of dealing with children with mental health disabilities because of isolation, don't you think that teacher training should be redesigned? And the policymakers, what they're doing in most countries, again, what I've seen is that they just make a policy that all children should be going to, there should be inclusive education. But then how that translates into a school is something we don't see practically happening, or there are gaps there.
Thank you, Faryal. And I'll add my question to it, Nidhi, because they're very interrelated. My question to you is, if you're thinking of inclusive education where children with disabilities or other vulnerabilities are studying in the same space, are we also, or should we also think of a teacher education where aspects of how to go about or include children coming from with diverse vulnerabilities or disabilities should be a part of regular teaching rather than another stream, special education? Over to you.
I cannot disagree with Faryal or with you, Tayaba. Absolutely. It's so important to make sure that our teacher training does not pigeonhole special education needs teaching separately. It is about good quality teaching. It's about different pedagogical approaches. Okay, so getting teacher training right is extremely important. And in lots of countries, there is some really interesting examples of in South Africa, for instance, of what they've done in relation to their teacher training to make it more inclusive of children with disabilities. That's worth looking at. And there's some other places, and I can send you some documents if you're interested. So teacher training is central. You cannot possibly expect your teachers to be trained in a certain way and land up in classrooms which look very different from what they've been trained to teach in. Absolutely. So for instance, if the only training you've got is to do chalk and talk pedagogy in your teacher training, right? You're going to do exactly that in your classroom. What does group work mean? If you're asked to do group work in your school, but there's nothing in teacher training which even closely resembles group work, and not just in the theory, but in the practice of it is really important. So absolutely, teacher training is key. But my argument also is teacher training is one aspect. Teacher support is also key. We tend to put a lot of focus on teacher training. That's really important, but it's one side of the picture. It's not the complete picture. And Faryal raises a really important point around what's happening now in relation to supporting teachers. So we argue that teachers are taking care of children now who are coming back from school closures, COVID, huge isolation. Totally right, absolutely right. How far have we thought about what is the status of the teachers themselves? Many of them have been isolated. Many of them would have lost loved ones during COVID. COVID has an impact on their mental health also. Are we thinking about any support for our teachers? So I totally buy your point, Faryal. There's very little work happening. And also, to me, begs the whole question about what all are we expecting a teacher to do? To be a counselor, to be a teacher, to be also doing pedagogical delivery in the classroom? So we really need to think about our schools holistically, but also thinking about what it means in a, if I may say so, post-COVID world, So there are bigger long-term questions, and I think this is to some extent what we argue. They're bigger long-term questions, but also some things which need to be done in the more immediate, because there are schools which have opened up, children are coming back, teachers are coming back, all of them need help.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Before we let you go, just 2 minutes, could you talk about intersectionality and how important it is when we are doing these studies?
Oh, wow. So we do intersectionalities in terms of what? I mean, there's so many dimensions of exclusion and so many variables that come together. So the ones which we talk about, especially when we're doing studies like this, we talk about gender very commonly. Yeah. We talk about caste, religion, tribe affiliation very commonly. But also, I think very important to remember is type of impairment group we're talking about, which doesn't usually get talked about. That's an intersecting variable. We need to talk about socioeconomic groupings. That's important. Well, sometimes, and this is what one of the things in Recoup that became really important, this birth order of the child with disability, and is it an acquired disability or a congenital disability, something that you've been born with? All these factors within disability research, I think, are really important to be sensitive to. Otherwise, there is a danger. Like, for instance, when I was presenting my work today, I homogenized disability to a large extent. I really didn't talk. I talked about gender a little. Income was the fact that it is a constant factor, but there are differences in types of impairment. But the reasons I didn't go into the details is because we don't have the power value in our little sample to be able to do that. But that's the important thing. Within disability, there are certain kinds of impairment groups who get privileged over others. Okay, and we need to be very, very, very sensitive to these differences.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Really, it has been a privilege and honor to have you over here for this fascinating discussion. Really look forward. I think we are going to definitely join your candor. And I mean, thank you so much for the invite, and thank you so much for being here.
Not at all, Tayaba. What I'm going to do, I'm going to send you the posters for our reading group and a seminar series. Do please circulate them to your student audience and to yourselves, and it'll be wonderful to see more people there. And thank you so much for inviting me and for everybody for your very fantastic questions. Thank you,
so
Tayaba.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye-bye.